5 years ago, you took everything and called me a thief. Today, I own the harvest that feeds your empire.
The moment Maya Lin stepped out of the gleaming black SUV and into the flashbulb-lit foyer of the Waldorf Astoria, the murmurs of the New York elite died in an instant, their eyes locking onto the brilliant, blood-red ruby resting against her collarbone. She smoothed the fabric of her emerald silk gown, ignoring the sudden, suffocating silence of the Cole family's annual charity gala. A silence broken only by the sharp intake of breath from Eleanor Cole, standing at the top of the grand staircase. "You have exactly 3 seconds to turn around and leave before I have security throw you out into the street where you belong." A cold, familiar voice vibrated close to her ear, the sheer venom in the tone making the hairs on her arms stand up. Damien Cole, the billionaire heir to the country's largest cocoa empire, stepped into her path, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked carved from granite, his jade-green eyes burning with a hatred that hadn't dulled in 5 years. "Good evening to you too, Damien," Maya replied, her voice a smooth, calm melody that betrayed none of the frantic drumming of her heart, her chin lifting as she met his furious gaze. "I wouldn't be so quick to call security if I were you, especially not on the woman who holds the pen to your company's survival." The air between them crackled with an electric, hostile energy, the ghosts of their past colliding violently with the reality of the present in the center of the opulent ballroom. Damien took a menacing step closer, his tall, broad-shouldered frame blocking her path, his eyes dropping to the necklace, the very heirloom his mother had accused Maya of stealing to fund her supposed betrayal. "Wearing stolen property to a high society gala is a bold move, even for a thief like you," he hissed, the scent of his expensive cedarwood cologne wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket, bringing back memories she had spent years trying to burn. Maya didn't flinch, her lips curving into a smile that was sharp enough to draw blood, a stark contrast to the naive, desperate girl he had thrown out of his penthouse 5 years ago. "The only thing stolen in this room is the foundation of your legacy, Damien. But we'll get to that later," she countered smoothly, leaning in just close enough for him to catch the scent of her jasmine perfume. "As for the necklace, I suggest you ask your mother how it magically appeared in the inventory of a Swiss auction house last month, fully authenticated and legally purchased by me." His gaze flickered a microscopic fraction of doubt, piercing his absolute certainty, but before he could formulate a response, the frantic click-clack of designer heels announced the arrival of the matriarch herself. Eleanor Cole pushed through the crowd of stunned onlookers, her usually immaculate composure fracturing as she stared at the ruby glittering on Maya's neck, her face draining of color beneath her perfect makeup. "Damien, get this lying grifter out of my sight immediately," Eleanor demanded, her voice shrill and trembling slightly as she grabbed her son's arm, her perfectly manicured fingers digging into the dark wool of his tailored tuxedo. Maya watched the older woman's panic with a cool, detached satisfaction, the sweet taste of vindication finally washing over, the bitter memories of being dragged out of this very building by security guards while Eleanor sneered from the balcony. "Careful, Eleanor, your desperation is showing, and it's a terrible look for a woman who prides herself on absolute control," Maya mocked softly, unfastening the sleek silver clasp of her clutch to pull out a beautifully embossed envelope. She pressed it flat against Damien's chest, her eyes locking onto his with a fierce, unyielding intensity that dared him to look away. "I'm not here to crash your party or steal your silverware, Mrs. Cole. I am here as the CEO of Terra Nova Agronomics, the exclusive supplier of the mutated cocoa strain your processing plants desperately need to avoid a catastrophic default next quarter. The silence that fell over the trio was absolute, heavier than the glittering chandeliers above, as Damien slowly took the envelope, the rigid lines of his face betraying a sudden, chilling realization of the trap closing around them. He tore open the heavy cardstock with brutal efficiency, his eyes darting across the legal jargon printed on the immaculate white paper, his formidable intellect processing the impossible truth in a matter of seconds. For the last 6 months, Cole Enterprises had been secretly fighting a losing battle against a devastating agricultural blight that was wiping out their standard crops, and their only salvation had been a newly patented, blight-resistant strain controlled by a shadowy European conglomerate. Terra Nova, you are the ghost CEO we've been trying to negotiate with for 3 months, Damien stated, his voice stripped of its earlier venom, replaced by a cold, calculating shock that sent a thrilling shiver down Maya's spine. Surprise, darling, she whispered the term of endearment dripping with a toxic, calculated sarcasm as she stepped back, reclaiming her personal space while relishing the absolute power she now held over the man who had broken her heart. Your purchasing department has been practically begging on their knees for a meeting, offering absurd premiums, but I prefer to conduct my business face to face, especially when the terms of surrender are this personal. Eleanor let out a strangled gasp, her hand flying to her throat as she looked from the contract to Maya's triumphant face. You cannot do this, you insignificant little nobody. We will crush you in court before you see a single dime of our money, the older woman spat, though the threat lacked its usual terrifying weight. Maya let out a dry, humorless laugh that echoed perfectly in the tense atmosphere, her posture radiating an untouchable authority that commanded the attention of everyone in their immediate vicinity. You don't have the time or the leverage for court, Eleanor, and we both know it, Maya stated, her gaze shifting to Damien, making sure he understood the absolute finality of her words. Your production lines halt in exactly 14 days without my raw materials. Your stock will plummet. Your investors will panic, and the century-old coal legacy will be sold off for scrap metal. Damien's jaw clenched tight enough to crack his teeth, the billionaire heir finding himself completely cornered by the very woman he had convinced himself was nothing more than an opportunistic traitor. What do you want, Maya? He demanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated with suppressed rage and a desperate need to protect his family's empire from the brink of annihilation. Money, revenge, name your price, and get the hell out of my life for good. She looked at his handsome, furious face, remembering the nights they had spent dreaming together before the nightmare began, before the betrayal and the lies tore them apart. Oh, I want everything, Damien, starting with your absolute, unconditional surrender on my terms, she said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. My lawyers have drafted a new supply agreement, and I expect you at my office tomorrow at 8 a.m. sharp to sign it, or I let your empire burn to the ground. Without waiting for a response, Maya turned on her heel, the emerald silk of her gown sweeping dramatically across the marble floor as she walked away from the stunned mother and son. Every eye in the ballroom followed her exit, the murmurs erupting into a deafening roar of high society gossip the second she crossed the threshold and stepped out into the freezing New York night. Inside Damien stood frozen the heavy cardstock of the contract, feeling like lead in his hands, his mind racing through 1,000 impossible scenarios to find a way out of the trap she had so perfectly sprung. Don't just stand there, Damien, do something, Eleanor hissed, her facade completely crumbled, her eyes wide with a frantic, uncharacteristic terror as she gripped his arm. She's bluffing. She has to be. She's just a researcher. She doesn't have the capital to control a global supply chain. But Damien didn't answer his mother. His gaze remained fixed on the grand doors where Maya had disappeared, his chest tight with a chaotic mixture of blazing fury and an undeniable, terrifying spark of the old attraction he thought he had killed. She wasn't bluffing. He knew it in his gut. The woman who had just brought his company to its knees was not the same fragile girl from 5 years ago. This was a war, and she had just fired the opening shot with devastating, absolute precision. The rest of the charity gala was a blur of forced smiles and hollow handshakes. For Damien, his formidable focus completely hijacked by the memory of Maya's triumphant, challenging eyes and the ruby resting on her skin. He retreated to the private balcony overlooking Fifth Avenue, the icy winter wind a welcome shock to his system, as he pulled his phone from his tuxedo pocket and dialed his chief operating officer. "Cancel everything on my schedule for tomorrow morning," Damien commanded. The moment the line connected, his voice a sharp blade cutting through the static. "I need our entire legal team to tear apart the Terra Nova Agronomics background, find out who her backers are, how she acquired the patent, and if there is any possible loophole to bypass her supply chain." He hung up before receiving a confirmation, staring down at the city lights, his mind returning to the anomaly of the necklace, the heirloom he had personally reported stolen to the police half a decade ago. If she had sold it to run away with her lover, as his mother had claimed, how did she have the resources to buy it back at a high-end Swiss auction? And why flaunt it tonight? The pieces of the puzzle he had blindly accepted 5 years ago were suddenly refusing to fit together, creating a jagged, uncomfortable picture that threatened the foundation of his reality. The next morning, the Manhattan skyline was painted in cold, unforgiving shades of gray as Maya stood behind the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office, watching the city wake up below her. She was dressed for war in a sharply tailored charcoal suit, her dark hair pulled back into a severe, no-nonsense bun, a physical armor against the emotional onslaught she knew was coming. The heavy mahogany doors of the conference room opened right on schedule, and Damien Cole walked in, looking like a storm cloud in a bespoke navy suit, his presence instantly consuming the oxygen in the room. He didn't bring his army of lawyers, entering the lion's den completely alone. A subtle power play designed to show her that he wasn't intimidated by her newfound authority. "You're on time. I appreciate punctuality in my subordinates," Maya remarked dryly, turning away from the window to take her seat at the head of the massive glass table, gesturing for him to sit opposite her. Damien's eyes narrowed dangerously at the deliberate insult, his jaw tight as he pulled out the leather chair and sat down, dropping the thick folder of the new supply agreement onto the table between them. "Let's skip the theatrical power trips, Maya, and get straight to the extortion," he said, his voice cold and analytical, completely devoid of the passionate fury from the night before. "I've read your terms, and they are nothing short of corporate suicide." Damien didn't wait for an invitation to speak, his fingers tapping a rhythmic, impatient beat against the mahogany surface as he slid a rival proposal across the glass. "You're asking for majority voting rights in the supply logistics and a guaranteed price floor that would bankrupt our domestic production within 2 years," he stated, his voice a razor-sharp clinical dissection of her terms. "I don't know what kind of fantasy you're living in, Maya, or who is bankrolling your little vendetta, but I'm here to tell you that Cole Enterprises doesn't sign suicide notes. Maya watched him with a cool, detached amusement, her posture radiating a poise that she had spent thousands of hours perfecting in boardrooms across Europe. She leaned back, tenting her fingers, and allowed the silence to stretch until Damien's composure began to fray at the edges, the phantom rhythm of his fingers finally slowing to a halt. You seem to be operating under the delusion that we are still in a partnership where your opinion holds weight, she replied, her voice low and steady, lacking even a hint of the tremor that used to plague her when she stood before him. Look at page 4 of that contract, Damien, and tell me again which one of us is writing the suicide note. Damien's eyes narrowed as he flipped through the pages, his gaze locking onto the fine print of the agricultural logistics clause, and he felt the blood drain from his face. It wasn't just a supply agreement, it was a comprehensive seizure of the distribution network that Cole Enterprises had spent decades building. She had somehow acquired the operating leases for the primary rail corridors in the Midwest, a move so strategic and so expensive, it was incomprehensible that a small startup could have orchestrated it. You bought the rail lines, he whispered, his voice incredulous, the cold facade finally fracturing into pure, unadulterated shock. That would cost billions in liquid capital you shouldn't have if you were just a struggling researcher in Paris. Maya allowed a faint, predatory smile to touch her lips, though she didn't offer him the satisfaction of an explanation regarding her secret benefactors or the high-stakes risk she had taken to secure her position. I'm not a researcher anymore, Damien. I'm a strategist who knows exactly where your house of cards is weakest, and right now you are standing in the middle of a collapsing storm. He stood up abruptly, the leather chair screeching against the floor, his presence filling the room with a raw, masculine energy that for a brief second made her heart skip a beat. You're doing this because you're still angry, because you think we wronged you, he growled, pacing the length of the office like a caged predator. His tie loosened as the stifling heat of the morning began to take hold. But you're destroying the livelihoods of thousands of farmers and employees just to get back at one man who didn't fight hard enough for you when his mother told him to get lost. Maya felt a sharp pang of hurt pierce through her professional armor at his words, the old familiar ache of knowing he had believed she abandoned him without a fight surfacing. You didn't just not fight hard enough, Damien. You watched them drag me out of your house while you held my signed resignation letter in your hand. You didn't even look me in the eye, she countered, her voice finally losing its cool composure, the jagged edges of her old pain cutting through the sharp, measured tone of the CEO. And don't you dare talk to me about the livelihoods of your farmers when you spent 5 years squeezing every cent of profit out of them while your mother was busy embezzling funds to cover her failed real estate gambles. Damien stopped pacing, the accusation hanging in the air like a thunderclap, his face paling as he turned to look at her, a flicker of confusion clouding his jade-green eyes. What are you talking about? My mother embezzling? He asked, his voice low and dangerous, his focus intensifying until it felt like he was reading her very soul for a lie. My mother has been the backbone of this company since my father died. She's the one who kept the board from voting me out after the divorce. Maya let out a harsh, bitter laugh, standing up to walk toward him, the clicking of her heels on the floor sounding like a ticking clock. She didn't keep them from voting you out, Damien. She kept them from finding out that she had leveraged the company's infrastructure as collateral for a private loan to cover her losses. She stopped just a few inches from him, the height difference between them forcing her to look up, but she refused to yield an inch. Why do you think she pushed for the Cocoa Blight testing programs to be accelerated without the proper FDA oversight 5 years ago? She needed a miracle, and she used your company's resources and my research to create one. Damien was silent, the pieces of a puzzle he had never dared to look at finally clicking into a terrifying, uncomfortable picture. The memory of his mother's desperate insistence on the accelerated timeline flashing back to him. He shook his head, his hands clenching at his sides as he fought against the rising tide of doubt that threatened to drown his faith in his own family. "You're lying," he muttered, though the conviction in his voice was missing, replaced by a hollow, searching desperation. "You're trying to turn me against her, because she's the only thing that stands between you and your complete control of this industry." Maya reached into her desk, pulling out a thin, encrypted memory drive and placing it squarely in his palm, her fingers lingering for a fraction of a second against his skin, sending a jolt of raw electricity through both of them. That drive contains every transaction, every offshore account, and the original unredacted lab logs that match my stolen research to your company's blight cure, she whispered, her voice dropping to a low, intimate register that carried more weight than her shouting ever could. "Look at it, Damien, and then tell me if I am still the villain of your story." Damien gripped the drive, his knuckles white, the weight of the small piece of plastic feeling like the weight of his entire world, his family's honor, and his personal identity. He looked at Maya, his eyes searching her face, not for a way to win the argument, but for some sign that this was all just a nightmare he could wake up from. "If this is true," he began, his voice breaking, "why didn't you show me this 5 years ago, instead of running away, instead of letting me believe you were the one who betrayed me?" Maya stepped back, her heart breaking all over again at the realization that he still believed the lie that she had chosen to leave, a lie his mother had crafted to perfection. "Because 5 years ago, Damien, you were the one who shoved my bags out the door before I could even open my mouth," she said, her voice a fragile whisper. "I didn't run away. I was discarded like a piece of faulty equipment, and your mother made sure I would never be able to come back to ask you why." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating, the air in the office thick with the weight of half a decade of lies, betrayals, and the wreckage of a love that had been dismantled before it could truly take root. Damien stood at the threshold of the office, his thumb tracing the edges of the drive, the man who was once the master of his universe, now looking like a man lost in a forest with no map. "I'm taking this drive," he said finally, his voice barely a murmur, not asking for her permission, but stating a fact that seemed to anchor him to the ground. "If this is real, Maya, the world as I know it is over, and I have a hell of a lot more to lose than just a supply contract." Maya watched him walk toward the door, her heart hammering against her ribs, the thrill of her impending victory now tainted by a confusing, overwhelming surge of sympathy for the man who was about to lose everything. "Damien," she called out just as he reached the door, and he paused, his back to her, his shoulders rigid and defensive. "If you take that path, there's no coming back. The Cole family will destroy you the moment they find out you're the one who leaked the truth." He turned around, his gaze locking onto hers, and for the first time in 5 years, she didn't see the cold, arrogant air, but the broken, searching boy he had been before the weight of the dynasty crushed him. "I've been living in a house of cards for long enough, Maya," he said, his voice quiet, resolute, carrying a gravity that sent a shiver of fear and excitement down her spine. Maybe it's time I saw what's on the other side of the fire. He left without another word, leaving her alone in the office. The quiet hum of the building, suddenly feeling like the calm before a storm that would shatter their lives, their legacies, and perhaps, eventually, give them the truth they had both been starving for. Maya turned back to the window, watching him walk out of the building and into the bustling streets of Manhattan. His tall, lonely figure disappearing into the crowd of people who would never understand the war being waged in the upper echelons of their reality. She knew he would be back. She knew he couldn't stay away from the truth. But she also knew that the road ahead was paved with glass, and they would both bleed before they reached the end. The subterranean archives of coal enterprises smelled of decaying paper and buried secrets, a stark contrast to the gleaming glass and steel of the executive floors above. Damien sat on the cold concrete floor, his bespoke suit ruined by the dust of 50 forgotten banker's boxes, the pale light of a single bare bulb illuminating the damning documents scattered around him. He had bypassed the digital servers, knowing his mother's IT team monitored every keystroke, and went straight for the physical paper trail from exactly 5 years ago. His fingers, slightly trembling, traced the jagged, hasty signature on the patent transfer, a signature that was supposedly Maya's, but lacked the distinct fluid loop of her M that he knew as intimately as his own name. It was a forgery, a clumsy, desperate forgery, executed by Eleanor Cole to steal the blight-resistant cocoa strain and save the company from a hidden bankruptcy. The encrypted drive Maya had given him wasn't a bluff. It was a meticulous, indisputable map of his family's utter moral rot. A sickening wave of nausea washed over him as the foundation of his entire identity fractured, the horrifying realization dawning that he had been the blind, obedient executioner of the only woman he had ever truly loved. Miles away in a sprawling, heavily guarded warehouse in Brooklyn that served as Terra Nova's temporary operational hub, Maya was dealing with Eleanor's desperate counterattack. The heavy iron doors rattled as 3 men in dark suits, flashing badges from a corrupt municipal port authority, demanded an immediate halt to all agricultural imports, citing anonymous biosecurity concerns. Maya stood at the top of the metal staircase, looking down at the hired thugs with a cold, predatory calmness that made her own security team shiver in admiration. You can tell Eleanor Cole that her little outdated intimidation tactics won't work on me. And if you don't step off my property in 10 seconds, my legal team will have your badges stripped and your pensions frozen, Maya declared, her voice echoing through the cavernous space like the crack of a whip. She didn't even wait for their response, turning her back and tapping a single command into her phone that immediately dispatched a fleet of high-powered corporate litigators to Eleanor's doorstep. 5 years ago, she would have panicked and run. Today, she simply crushed the threat under the heel of her designer stiletto, relishing the frantic, pathetic flailing of a dying empire. The storm that broke over New York that evening was biblical. A torrential downpour that turned the streets into slick black mirrors, matching the violent tempest raging inside Damien's shattered mind. He drove his car straight to the Brooklyn warehouse, ignoring the speed limits and the blaring horns of the city traffic, driven by a primal, agonizing need to see her, to look into her eyes, now that the blindfold had been ripped from his own. He bypassed her expensive, private security detail with a dangerous, reckless determination, pushing through the heavy side doors, just as Maya was shutting down her workstation for the night. She spun around, her hand instinctively reaching for the silent alarm button hidden beneath the edge of her desk. But she froze when she saw him standing there, soaking wet, his chest heaving, holding the crumpled, forged patent transfer in his hand. "You were right about everything." Damien choked out the words, tearing from his throat like jagged shards of glass, his jade-green eyes red-rimmed and hollowed out by absolute devastation. "My mother forged your signature. She stole your life's work to cover her embezzlement, and she used my trust in her to throw you out into the freezing street." Maya lowered her hand from the alarm her heart, executing a painful, frantic somersault against her ribs at the sight of the untouchable billionaire heir standing before her completely broken. She had imagined this moment for 1,000 sleepless nights, dreaming of the day he would discover the truth and beg for forgiveness. But the reality of his agony brought her no satisfaction, only a deep, echoing sadness. "I told you, Damien, the only thing stolen in that ballroom was the foundation of your legacy," she said, maintaining her distance, wrapping her arms around her waist as a protective barrier against the magnetic pull of his vulnerability. "Your mother orchestrated the theft of my necklace to make me look like a desperate gold digger, knowing you would prioritize the family's honor over a girl who came from nothing." He closed his eyes, a shudder ripping through his broad shoulders as the memory of his own cruel words from 5 years ago echoed in the cold industrial space. "I was a fool, a blind, arrogant fool who let pride dictate my heart, and I don't expect you to ever forgive me, Maya," he whispered, opening his eyes to look at her with a raw, burning intensity. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her, the sound of the rain hammering against the tin roof filling the silence, the space between them shrinking with every agonizing heartbeat. "But what I don't understand, what has been driving me insane since I saw those logs, is why you didn't fight for us," Damien pleaded, his voice breaking as he stopped just inches away. The overwhelming scent of rain, cedarwood, and masculine despair enveloping her. "You are the fiercest, most brilliant woman I have ever met, so why did you just pack your bags and disappear without screaming the truth until I had no choice but to listen?" Maya felt a hot tear escape her strict control, tracing a fiery path down her cheek as the carefully constructed walls of her revenge began to crack under the weight of his proximity. "Because she didn't just threaten me with jail time, Damien. She threatened you," Maya confessed, her voice a ragged, breathless sob that laid bare the agonizing sacrifice she had carried for half a decade. "Eleanor showed me fabricated evidence that implicated you in the corporate fraud. She told me that if I fought the theft, she would let you take the fall and rot in federal prison to save herself." The absolute horrifying truth of her sacrifice hit Damien with the force of a derailed freight train, knocking the breath completely from his lungs as he realized she hadn't run away to save herself, but to save him from a prison sentence. The profound tragedy of their lost years, the millions of moments stolen by his mother's grotesque manipulation and his own arrogant blindness, snapped the last remaining threads of his legendary self-control. With a low, desperate groan that vibrated from the very depths of his soul, Damien reached out his large hands, gripping her waist and pulling her flush against his solid, trembling frame. He didn't ask for permission, and she didn't offer a single ounce of resistance. His mouth crashed down on hers in a catastrophic collision of starvation, grief, and an explosive, undeniable passion that had survived 5 years of bitter frost. It was not a calculated kiss, nor a gentle reunion of estranged lovers. It was a rough, wet, bruising, claiming a desperate, frantic attempt to devour the space, the lies, and the cruel time that had kept them apart. Maya gasped against his lips, her hands instinctively flying up to fist in his damp hair, kissing him back with a furious, answering hunger that betrayed every cold vow she had made to destroy him. She tasted the salt of his tears and the bitter chill of the rain, her body melting against the hard, unyielding lines of his chest. As the sterile industrial warehouse around them faded into absolute nothingness. Every touch, every frantic, breathless slide of their lips was a silent confession of the love they had both tried to assassinate, but had only managed to bury alive under layers of corporate armor. He backed her up against the edge of the heavy wooden desk, his hands dropping to cup her face, his thumbs feverishly wiping away her tears as he deepened the kiss, demanding everything she had left to give, and offering his own shattered soul in return. For a fleeting, magnificent eternity, there was no coal enterprises, no Terra Nova agronomics, no thirst for revenge, and no history of betrayal. There was only Damien and Maya, two halves of a fractured whole, desperately trying to fuse themselves back together in the dark. When they finally, agonizingly broke apart to breathe, their chests were heaving, their foreheads resting against one another, as they remained locked in a tight, trembling embrace. Damien stared into her dark, dilated eyes, the ghost of the kiss still burning on his lips, a new, terrifyingly clear purpose solidifying in the depths of his soul. The corporate prince was dead, and the man who remained was ready to burn the world to the ground for the woman in his arms. I am going to tear my mother's empire apart, piece by piece, Maya, Damien vowed, his voice a lethal, vibrating promise in the quiet warehouse, his gaze unwavering and absolute. I don't care about the money, the legacy, or the name anymore. Tomorrow I am handing you the matches, and we are going to watch it all burn together. Maya looked at the fierce determination in his eyes, knowing that this was the point of no return, that the final, devastating battle for the truth was about to begin, and for the first time in 5 years, she wasn't facing it alone. The fallout within the halls of coal enterprises was instantaneous and devastatingly public, echoing the seismic shift that had occurred in the Brooklyn warehouse. Damien walked into the boardroom at 8 a.m., not as the poised, untouchable CEO, but as a man bearing the sword of truth, his eyes devoid of the usual corporate indifference. He didn't take his seat at the head of the table. Instead, he stood before the board of directors, his shadow stretching across the polished surface like a harbinger of doom. For 5 years, we have built our reputation on innovation and integrity, Damien said, his voice ringing through the hushed, cavernous chamber. But that legacy is a lie, built on theft, coercion, and the systematic destruction of a brilliant woman's life. He tossed a thick, black-bound dossier onto the table. The accumulation of the lab logs, the falsified patent records, and the evidence of his mother's clandestine financial maneuvers. Eleanor sat at the opposite end of the table, her face draining of color, as she watched the board members pass around the evidence of her lifelong deceptions, her composure shattering into a frantic, incoherent mess of denials. The twist that had been simmering for 5 years finally boiled over when Damien bypassed the board's attempt to bury the documents by live streaming the evidence directly to the major financial news networks. He didn't just expose his mother, he dismantled his own position as CEO, admitting to his complicity in the initial cover-up, however unintentional it had been. I am stepping down from my role, he announced to a room full of stunned, terrified investors, and I am handing over all control of the coal distribution network to Terra Nova Agronomics as the first step in our restitution. Eleanor stood up, her voice a sharp, shrill shriek that cut through the silence of the room. "You have destroyed us. You have thrown away everything your father and I bled for," she cried, her eyes wide with a manic, unhinged fury. Damien turned to her, his gaze cold, final, and liberated the chains of his family's expectations, finally falling from his shoulders like shards of broken glass. "You bled for power, Mother. I am bleeding for the truth." While the empire was burning, Maya was already in motion, her legal team executing the hostile takeover with a lethal surgical efficiency that left the remaining board members scrambling. She stood in the center of the boardroom, watching the chaotic collapse of the structure that had once been her prison, her eyes meeting Damien's across the wreckage. The look they exchanged wasn't one of triumph. It was a silent, profound understanding, a shared recognition of the cost they had paid to reach this moment. As the security team escorted a sobbing, hysterical Eleanor from the building, Damien remained behind, looking remarkably calm in the face of his own impending ruin. He approached Maya, who was now seated where he had sat just an hour ago, her hands folded calmly on the table. "It's done," he said, his voice low, lacking the heavy weight of the dynasty he had finally discarded. "The board is in shock, the stock is plummeting, and I am officially a man with nothing left to protect." Maya stood up, her legs feeling like lead as she moved toward him, the distance between them feeling like the most significant journey of her life. She reached out her fingers, touching the fabric of his suit, the same suit he had worn to destroy his own life for her. "You didn't have to give it all up, Damien," she whispered, her voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming surge of regret and adoration. "You could have negotiated, found a compromise." He shook his head, a small, sad smile playing on his lips, as he reached out to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear, a gesture so tender it made her heart ache. "I spent 5 years trying to control the world because I was afraid of losing what I had. But I lost the only thing that mattered the moment I let you walk out of that penthouse," he said, his green eyes searching hers with a desperate, naked hope. "I don't want a legacy, Maya. I want a future, and I'm ready to start it with you, even if it means we have to build it from the ashes." The realization that he had truly shed the cold, arrogant, and controlling version of himself hit her with the force of a tidal wave. He hadn't just saved her or fixed a mistake. He had fundamentally transformed choosing her over the only identity he had ever known. Maya took his hand, her palm pressed against his, the warmth of his skin an anchor in the storm of their lives. "Then let's start building," she replied, her voice ringing with a newfound, unshakable strength. The war was far from over. There would be lawsuits, investigations, and years of rebuilding their reputations. But as they stood in the ruins of the empire, they were finally truly equal. The power had shifted from the board of directors to the two of them, and for the first time, the future wasn't something happening to them. It was something they were deciding together. They walked out of the building hand in hand, the bright, unforgiving light of the city awaiting them. But they were no longer afraid of the glare. The truth, as bitter as it had been, had finally freed them. 6 months later, the landscape of the global agricultural industry had been irrevocably altered. Yet for Maya and Damien, the world felt smaller, more manageable, and profoundly peaceful. They stood on the terrace of a small, renovated farmhouse in the heart of the cocoa-growing region they had once fought to control. The air scented with the rich, earthy aroma of drying beans and the sweet bloom of tropical jasmine. They had traded the cold, sterile boardrooms of Manhattan for a reality built on transparency and genuine partnership, working side by side to establish a fair trade collective that prioritized the farmers over the profit margins. The scandal that had once threatened to consume them had died down, replaced by the slow, steady labor of rebuilding their lives and reputations from the ashes of the Cole legacy. Damien, no longer bound by the crushing weight of the family name, looked different, his posture relaxed, the permanent tension that once defined his jawline now replaced by the easy smile of a man who finally owned his own choices. Maya watched him from the shade of the veranda, a cup of morning coffee in her hands, as he walked up the path, his boots stained with the red earth of the plantation. He looked less like the billionaire heir and more like the man she had secretly loved before the 5 years of bitterness and lies had set in. He climbed the steps and pulled her into his arms, a lingering, comfortable embrace that held the quiet certainty of two people who had weathered the ultimate storm and emerged stronger on the other side. The final audit for the transition was signed this morning, Damien murmured into her hair, his voice low and rich with satisfaction. We are officially free of the last entanglements, Maya. No more lawyers, no more press, just us. She leaned back in his arms, looking up into the eyes that had once looked at her with such cold fury, now filled with a devotion that made her chest ache with a simple, pure joy. It feels surreal, she admitted, a slow smile touching her lips as she thought back to the night of the gala, the night she had walked into the lion's den with a ruby necklace and a burning need for vengeance. I spent 5 years obsessing over destroying your life, only to realize that I was mostly just destroying my own. Damien tightened his grip on her, pressing a soft kiss to her temple, his gaze steady and profound. We both lost 5 years to my mother's greed and my own pride, he said, his voice soft but unwavering. But I wouldn't trade the lessons of the past 6 months for anything. They forced me to see who I truly am and who I want to be with. He reached into his pocket not for a contract or a legal document, but for a simple piece of paper he had kept with him since the day they decided to rebuild everything together. It was the original stained and crumpled copy of the first supply agreement they had negotiated in the warehouse, the document that had started their reconciliation. He unfolded it and placed it on the small bistro table between them, producing a pen with a mischievous glint in his eye. Our final binding contract, he said, his voice brimming with a quiet, bottomless love as he signed his name at the very bottom of the page, where the space was almost entirely filled with their notes and revisions. Maya laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated happiness that echoed across the quiet plantation, mirroring the joy she had only ever dared to dream of during those long, lonely years. She picked up the pen, her hand steady, and signed her name beside his, sealing their future, not with the weight of corporate obligation, but with the freedom of two souls who had finally found their truth. As the sun began to climb higher, painting the lush greenery of the plantation in brilliant, vibrant hues of life, they stood together, looking out over the rows of young, healthy trees. Their story had begun with a bitter harvest of lies, a tangled web of betrayal that had nearly destroyed them both. But it had ended here in a field of new beginnings, a testament to the undeniable fact that the most enduring harvests are those sown in truth and nurtured by love. The past was a scar they would always carry, but it was no longer a cage. It was the foundation upon which they were building a life of purpose, partnership, and unconditional devotion. They turned away from the fields, walking toward the quiet warmth of their home. Two people who had finally lost everything to find the one thing that truly mattered. And for the first time in their lives, both Maya and Damien were completely, perfectly home.